Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Marie Renvelez with USC Visions and Voices, the Arts and Humanities Initiative. Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's event, Politics and Policies, Fighting for the Health and Well-Being of Children at the Border, a lecture by Dr. Colleen Kraft. It is amazing that we have people tuning in from across the country here today. And at Visions and Voices, we believe it's important to open our events by acknowledging the Indigenous land that we share. By presenting lectures and conversations like the ones we have today, part of the work that we do is to make the invisible visible. We also believe that it is not the responsibility of those who have been made invisible to remind us that they are still here. Therefore, the Visions and Voices program acknowledges that the University of Southern California, both the University Park campus and the Health Sciences campus, were built on the ancestral and sacred land of the Tongva Nation. We honor the Tongva and all Indigenous people, past, present, and future, and we pay respect to their continued survival and contributions to our society. We also honor the legacy of the African diaspora and recognize that this country would not exist without the free and slave labor of Black people. We share these acknowledgements to raise the awareness about histories that are too often erased or forgotten, to pay respect to the original caretakers of this land, and to recognize our place in this history. We hope that this work continues beyond our events and helps to inform our individual and collective actions in the years ahead and for generations to come. Thank you. I would now like to hand this off to the wonderful people who have worked hard on the organizing and production for today's event, with Dr. Colleen Kraft. Please welcome Dr. Pamela Schaff, who is the Director of the Humanities, Ethics, Art, and the Law, or HEAL program, and Director of Keck School of Medicine's Master of Science in Narrative Medicine graduate program. Welcome, Dr. Schaff.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much, Marie. Today's Visions and Voices talk by Dr. Colleen Kraft is, of course, because of COVID, an online event. And I want to begin by thanking the entire Visions and Voices team, Marie, of course, and Daria Yadakovsky for their flexibility and their creativity in helping us deliver today's session. I also want to thank our incomparable audiovisual team, Patrick Crispin and Dan Villaseñor, as well as my faculty colleagues, Alex Capron, Ron Bennery, and Erica Wright. Thanks also to our captioners for their work on today's program. Dr. Colleen Kraft received her undergraduate degree at Virginia Tech, her MD from Virginia Commonwealth University, and her MBA from the University of Cincinnati. She completed her residency in pediatrics at Virginia Commonwealth. Her background includes work in primary care pediatrics, pediatric education, and healthcare financing. She led a pediatric accountable care program at Cincinnati Children's from 2014 to 2017, where her financial model incorporated investments to address the social determinants of health, population health data-driven quality improvement initiatives, and improved payment for primary care services. Since 2019, Dr. Kraft has been a professor of pediatrics at Keck School of Medicine and an attending physician at Children's Hospital Los Angeles. Since the 1998 landmark Adverse Childhood Experiences, or ACEs study in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine, research has confirmed the relationship between adversity in childhood and higher levels of morbidity and mortality in adulthood, and uncovered the connections between the two at molecular, behavioral, and societal levels. The devastating effects of emotional trauma and toxic stress in children are nowhere more evident than in the crisis at the U.S. Mexico border. A past president of the American Academy of Pediatrics, Dr. Kraft is best known for her advocacy for humane treatment of migrant children at the border. Her work to explain to the public the harms to young children caused by the zero tolerance policy that included separation of children from parents helped to mobilize advocates across the political spectrum to end this policy. She continues to advocate for the rights and health of children throughout the world in ways that mobilize and inspire. Dr. Kraft will speak to us for about 35 minutes, and then we'll have time for a few questions. You may submit questions through the Q&A function at any time, and she will answer as many as time allows. Dr. Kraft, welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Schaff, and to all of the faculty and the staff and those to help to put this together. And let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to be talking about policies and politics and fighting for the well-being of children at the southern border. I have some faculty disclosure information and then our learning objectives. So first one, recognizing the sources of trauma for young children migrating from Central America. Secondly, describing the unfortunate additional trauma these families given the United States immigration policy currently. And then finally, as a healthcare community, committing to incorporating the adverse childhood experiences into your approach to medical care for individuals in our immigrant, refugee, and asylum seeker community. So let's get started. I'm going to go through an overview of what we'll talk about this afternoon. First of all, the path into the United States and what it takes for an individual to leave their home and come to the United States to seek asylum. Secondly, the focus on adverse childhood experiences and its relationship to early brain development. Then I'll talk about separation of parents and children at the border and our experiences in 2018. We'll talk about children and families and unaccompanied minors who are being treated in all kinds of horrific ways right now. We're going to talk about public charge and immigration raids and some of what we're seeing happening in the United States currently. Some recent updates, what's happened because of COVID-19 and the migrant protection protocol, which is the Remain in Mexico policy. And then finally, our voice as a medical community. What is it that we can do to help out individuals who have come to our country from Central America? So let's get started with some definitions. Who is an immigrant? An immigrant is a person who migrates to another country, usually to take up permanent residence. This includes people who may have come to the United States legally. They may have come with a visa. They may have come as a traveler, and then they've stayed. Our undocumented immigrants are that specific category of immigrants who describe people who enter without legal permission, as well as those who fail to leave when their permissible time ends. What's the difference between an immigrant and a refugee? A refugee is somebody who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership in particular social groups, is coming to our country out of fear. They are fleeing an area where they may lose their life or lose other privileges, and they're unwilling to return to that country. The difference between a refugee and asylum seeker is that an asylum seeker is the same, except that their request for sanctuary is yet to be processed. So let's talk a little bit about some of the images you see at the border and who's in charge of which places. This is really important because we see so many images, and it's important to know where these come from and who's in charge of these facilities. So the Department of Homeland Security runs two agencies, the U.S. Customs and Border Protection and the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Customs and Border Protection run the CBP border facilities, the cages. When you've seen pictures of people crowded in these facilities, cages, sleeping under Mylar blankets, those are run by Customs and Border Protection. ICE, or Immigration and Customs Enforcement, run the family detention centers, as well as other detention centers where there are not children. But there are 3 in the United States where you will find children. The first one is in Dilley, Texas, and those are mothers and children. The second one is in Karnes, Texas, and those are fathers and sons. And then there is one more facility in Pennsylvania that has other parents and other children. Now, this is different than the Department of Health and Human Services, which runs the Office of Refugee Resettlement, or ORR, and they run the shelters. So these are the shelters for little kids, the tender age shelters, and these are the children who were by and large separated from their parents, as well as the shelters for unaccompanied minors. And again, this comes from the Department of Health and Human Services. So let's start with the countries that people come from. Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. The northern part, the northern triangle of Central America is where we see most of our families coming from. And the United States has a sordid history with this part of the world. And this really is owing back to the United Fruit Company back in the 1900s that planted the banana plantations, primarily in Guatemala, but in other countries as well in Central America. And what happened was the United Fruit Company took over a lot of the land and had very close relationships with some of the leaders in these countries. And when the people decided to elect a democratically elected president to take back some of the land, the United Fruit Company went to the United States and said, oh, they're communists. And so we have to get rid of communists. And then what would happen is there would be militia that would take care of the communists, and the communists would come back and become guerrillas, and fighting ensued. And over a century of this, these companies have been left in rags and with lots of violence and lots of gangs and lots of problems in these countries. And that's really where our kids are coming from and our parents are coming from. And when you ask your families, why did you come? They will tell you it's violence in the home country, violence in the home, deprivation, no opportunity at all. And families are actually very graphic when you talk with them about that. I've talked to several families who have said, we woke up and the family next door was machine gunned down because they wouldn't pay the fees to the gangs coming through. So there is definite fear, and the fear to the point of motivating people to leave with little children. The path is long and arduous. At its shortest distance, the travel from Honduras to the U.S. Mexico border is about 1,500 miles. And it's a dangerous journey. There are gangs, there is exposure to lots of crime, there's hunger, there's thirst, there are medical conditions that are not being cared for. And this is something that our families come to the border with, already having experienced. If you think about this as a child, this is an adverse childhood experience and is a problem as these kids come to the border. But this is only part of the scope of global displacement. So we see the numbers of people coming from Central America to the United States. They are a small part of the almost 71 million people who are forcibly displaced worldwide. And if you think about where people are going to, the bottom part of this slide shows the kids and the people coming from Central America to the United States. They are far in the minority when you look at the number of people coming from Syria to Turkey and to other countries, from Venezuela, from the Democratic Republic of Congo. Our refugees are just a small part of this global movement of refugees because of violence and deprivation in home countries. So what happens when people get to the border? The process is that you would come to a Customs and Border Protection official and you would claim asylum because of fear. You would be given a credible fear interview and then processed and wait your turn in immigration court, and then eventually be connected with families in the United States. This isn't happening. So the picture on the right is the picture of the Reynosa Bridge, where our migrants are coming and they are staying there for days because Customs and Border Protection are not processing them, or they're processing 2 people a day. And I actually saw this when I was down there in June of 2018. We ran into a mother from Honduras who was standing there crying with her 5-year-old because she had been there for days and she didn't have water and she didn't have food and nobody would let her in. And so being the Americans that we were, we said, you know, what about this lady out here? Can we just bring her along here with us? And of course, Customs and Border Protection processed her right away, but she was an exception. People stood there for days. So what happens when you can't get through the right way? Well, you come across any way you can, which is the picture on the left, people crossing the Rio Grande and swimming in very dangerous conditions, and many people have lost their lives doing this because they're not allowed to come in the legal way. So very different than 20 years ago when we had a number of adult males coming from Mexico and Central America to cross the border and find work in the United States. These people came across the border and they did everything they could to avoid Customs and Border Protection. Our families are not doing that. They are seeking out Customs and Border Protection to claim asylum, to leave the fear and to leave the violence in their home country. And what's happening is they are winding up, first of all, in these customs border processing facilities. And they have been very crowded. They are very cold. They're kept cold. There's little food and water. There are open toilets. Lights are on 24/7. These are really horrible places. And if you talk with Customs and Border Protection, they will tell you these were designed for adult males, not for families with children. Well, let's talk about adverse childhood experiences because we've seen some pictures of some really awful experiences. What are they? They're a mix of experiences and exposures in childhood that are a major risk for certain illnesses and poor quality of life. So these include physical, sexual, emotional abuse, neglect, exposure to mental illness or substance abuse or domestic violence within your household, divorce or separation of parents and caregivers, incarceration of a parent or caregiver. And what we know is that early on, the more adverse childhood experiences you have as a very young child in the first 3 years of life, the more likely you are to have developmental delay. If you have more than 4 adverse childhood experiences, you are 50% likely to have a delay in your development. And that is a lifelong disability. So how do we define adversity or stress? Because we know that different people react different ways to different experiences. Well, the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child came up with some ideas and language based on the hypothalamic pituitary axis reactivity, based on measuring stress through levels of cortisol, epinephrine and norepinephrine, and other inflammatory markers. And they named the reactive patterns of stress as positive, tolerable, and toxic stress. And again, this is based on the human reaction or animal reaction, objective physiologic responses to some of these adverse experiences. So what is positive stress? Positive stress is the brief and infrequent, mild to moderate intensity stress that happens in normal childhood. You fall down and you hurt yourself. And as you're crying, those levels of epinephrine and norepinephrine and cortisol are rising. And in the presence of a caring adult, there's a social emotional buffer, and those levels return to baseline. We see this all the time. The 15-month-old, and you tell them no to something, and they have that temper tantrum, and you can just see their cortisol and epinephrine and norepinephrine rising. And that loving parent lets them get through that, calms them down, redirects them. Well, what that does to the brain is it actually builds motivation and resiliency. And that child learns that somebody can say no to me and I'm going to be okay. Understand that positive stress is not the absence of stress. Those of us in pediatric practice see lots of families where we could use a little bit of positive stress. But this is a really important differentiator than toxic stress, which I'm going to talk about. This is very different. This is long-lasting, strong intensity, the most extreme precipitants of adverse childhood experiences. These are kids who are exposed to neglect, abuse, household dysfunction. And the real key to toxic stress is this, that there is insufficient social emotional buffering. There's not that adult who can help you process these feelings and help these chemicals return to baseline. And because of that, the kids who are exposed to toxic stress stay on red alert all the time. They don't know when something is going to be hurtful or harmful or good for them. These are the children who may be in foster care, who have been abused and neglected, and somebody comes to give them a hug and they bite them. They lash out them because they are on high alert all the time. And this causes potential permanent damage to the brain. And it's most important with very young children because we know that by age 3, 80% of synaptic connections are already made. And by the second decade of life, the brain starts pruning these connections. If the strong connections are love, our emotional responsiveness, our language, our reading, our math and building, that stays. And what gets pruned away is fear and some of the adverse events in your life. But if those strong connections are fear, our loneliness, our abuse, our hunger, then that stays. And what gets pruned away is the ability to speak, to understand, to begin to relate to somebody else. And if you think about this in terms of brain development, we're born with our cerebral cortex and our occipital lobe. So we've got visual processing, the cerebellum, which coordinates our smooth movements, and brainstem and cranial nerves for vital functions and swallowing. Somewhere around 4 months of age, the parietal lobe kicks in, and that's that integration of sensory data and movement. That's where you reach out purposefully and grasp something. A child who has been exposed to toxic stress might not do this. You think about the limbic system, which comes in at about 12 months of age. This is emotions and impulsivity. This is the reason why a 4-month-old doesn't have temper tantrums. Their limbic system isn't developed yet. But think about that 12-month-old who is taken away from that loving parent, and they don't have somebody to help them control their emotions and impulsivity. That part of the brain doesn't develop. Think about the temporal lobe around age 2. This is when we process sound and language. This is why we can't tell a 12-month-old to use their words. They don't have them yet. But we can tell a 2-year-old to use your words when you're upset. And let's see what we can do about that. And if there's toxic stress occurring at 2 years of age, language doesn't develop. Well, let's think about some of our parents and some of our teenagers and frontal lobe. So I get the question a lot, if that early brain development is so important, then what happens to a teenager? Well, a teenager is developing abstract thought, reasoning, judgment, planning, all of what we talk about in terms of executive functioning. And if that trauma occurs then what you have is inattention, distractibility, poor judgment, depression, anxiety. You can see how this develops with kids. And so that impact of childhood stress is that chronic fight or flight norepinephrine cortisol causing changes in the brain architecture, which results in hyper responsive stress response and decreased calm and coping. And that's toxic stress. And this is how toxic stress is so damaging for that early brain development. So let's get back to the border here. I was president of the American Academy of Pediatrics in 2018, and many of our pediatric colleagues in Texas were saying children are being taken away from their parents at the border. And we heard later on that, in fact, this was the president's zero tolerance policy. And it happened because these people are felons and they have to take their children away. I was able to go to one of the tender age shelters that was run by the Office of Refugee Resettlement in 2018. And the first room I walked into was a room of toddlers. And you've been in a room of toddlers before. They're rambunctious, they're busy, they're talking, they're loud. And in this room, everybody was quiet, except for one little girl, little 18-month-old, who was just screaming and crying and couldn't be consoled. And the staff were trying. They were trying to give her toys and they were trying to give her books. The staff are not allowed to pick up and hold children and comfort them in that way. And they were doing the best they could. And we all looked at these children and we knew what they were missing. They were missing their parent. Out of no fault of their own, they were taken away from their parents. And you could just see the toxic stress ensuing in these little children's brains. And because of that, I actually wrote an article that appeared in the Los Angeles Times in May of 2018 that was called "Separating Parents from Their Kids at the Border Contradicts Everything We Know About Child's Welfare." And applying the whole idea of toxic stress to these young developing brains and knowing that taking them away from that one important loved parent would actually create brain damage with them. I called this what it was and still is: government sanctioned child abuse. Well, that actually got a lot of press. And one of the first calls I actually got while I was in clinic and seeing a patient was from Oprah Winfrey. And Oprah wanted to know what she could do about this. And so she said, I'm going to get you in touch with Gail King at CBS This Morning. And we went down to the border to the Ursula Processing Center and talked about brain development and toxic stress and what we were doing to damage these young children coming across the border. And in the next week, we had 55 interviews talking about toxic stress and brain development and separation of parents and children. And we mobilized people from across the political spectrum. We were from Gayle King and Oprah Winfrey to Laura Bush saying, you do not take children away from their parents, that is wrong, and that this is going to cause brain damage. And the zero tolerance policy was technically ended in June of 2018, although sadly it is still going on. So what would we know since then? We know that about 2,600 kids had been separated from their parents at that point, but that the US had planned to separate 10 times that many before this public outcry. So our advocacy worked at a point. We were able to prevent a lot more damage going on there, but there still are problems down at the border. So what happens with children and families once they actually are across and through that Customs and Border Protection, the cages? They are brought to a family detention center. And this is some pictures from Dilley, Texas, which is one of the family detention centers where there are parents, mothers, and children. And you walk in there, and we actually had a guide from ICE who took us around and showed us everything, including the playgrounds and the clinics and where people were able to eat and get snacks. But there was a huge disconnect between what we were shown and what was actually happening. And I went with a Human Rights Watch group who wanted to interview families. And when we talked with the families said, our children are sick. And we go to the clinic and they say, come back tomorrow, go away. That playground that you see there looked just like that. So when you go to the playground, you have mothers and children clinging to each other, nobody playing on the playground. And when you ask the parents why, they say, well, the guards tell us that if something happens to your child, it's on you. And again, you can see the stress. You can see the toxic stress happening with these children who are not allowed to do some of the normal things that children do. Incidentally, we saw some very sick children when we interviewed the parents. And at one point, I took the ICE agent around and I said, this child needs to go to the emergency room. This one needs to. And these were kids with fever, with dehydration, with boils, who were not allowed to go to the clinic. Well, what about unaccompanied minors, and who are unaccompanied minors? These are children who, by and large, are sent by their families across the border because it's often the kids who have the threats. It is the young man who doesn't want to join a gang, and the gang has said, you will join us or we will kill you. Or we will take your sister and she'll become a gang girlfriend. And so many of the families were sending their kids as young as 10 years of age alone to cross the border. When you become an unaccompanied minor, you are apprehended at Customs and Border Protection, placed in a Department of Homeland Security detention center. And then if you're deemed to be under 18 years of age, you're transferred from Department of Homeland Security, again, to the Department of Health and Human Services and into a shelter within 72 hours. The shelters for unaccompanied minors were designed to be a temporary holding place until a sponsor could be vetted. And by and large, most of these kids have sponsors in the United States. They have family members or others in the United States. There's supposed to be a limit of 20 days in maximum in the shelters. And that there are categories of potential sponsors. Many times it is a parent or an immediate relative, a brother, a sister, an aunt, a grandparent who wants to sponsor this child coming into the United States. Category 3 are other sponsors, distant relatives or friends. And then category 4 are no sponsors identified. But the vast majority of kids actually do have sponsors. Well, at one point in 2018, there was a great delay in getting these children from these shelters to their sponsors. And what was happening is that the administration was requiring that everybody in the household where that child would go be fingerprinted, rather than one person from that household who was the sponsor. And as you can imagine, there were a number of undocumented people in these households, and so they were afraid to be fingerprinted. At the same time, the Trump administration was not requiring people working in the shelters to be fingerprinted. So you can imagine how that would go. You're not requiring people who are taking care of vulnerable youth to have a significant background check, while at the same time not letting these kids leave. And so what happened was eventually it was ruled that this was not appropriate and that these kids went to back to their families. So one really important concept here is the Flores Settlement Agreement. This was an agreement that was made because of a plaintiff, Jenny Flores, and how she was being treated as an unaccompanied minor. And the Flores Settlement Agreement actually is an agreement that sets forth how these kids will be treated: proper physical care and maintenance, routine medical and dental care with a evaluation in the first 48 hours getting into the country, individual needs assessments, educational services, the ability to call a parent or a relative, a minimum of 1 counseling session per week and 2 group counseling sessions. These are the protections that unaccompanied minors have in the United States. And this is why so many families would send their kids up there, because they knew there were going to be some protections there. But this is also why we never had an agreement on the wall back in January of 2017, February 2017, when Congress appropriated up to $25 billion for the wall. It didn't happen because some of our folks in Congress wanted to give up these Flores Settlement Agreement protections as part of the deal. And there were enough of our Republican colleagues who said, no, you can't decrease human rights abilities for these children as part of the settlement. So we never got the wall, and the Flores Settlement Agreement remained intact. But it is always something that is under attack. So I'm going to move over to public charge. Public charge is the whole idea that if you come into the country, you need to be able to support yourself. And this came back to the early 20th century when immigrants received stipends from the United States. By and large, that has gone away. But in many of our states, our immigrants and refugees do receive Medicaid, do receive food stamps, do receive some other services, Section 8 housing vouchers. And the idea of public charge is that if you are coming to the United States, even as a legal immigrant, you're going through the green card process. If you use any of these services, you can be deported. And this has caused a great deal of fear in our communities. This is something that we see day to day in Altamed at CHLA, is that families don't understand what services they can apply for them or for their child, who by and large is usually a United States citizen. And they are making the hard choice between staying in this country with their child or getting some of the services that they need to eat, to live somewhere. ICE raids that target migrant families. This has been something that has been problematic as well too. We have had ICE that has targeted places where migrants were recruited to work. Many of them meat packing plants and other places where companies couldn't get American citizens to work. And so they brought in migrants and their visas expired. And sadly, as kids were going to school, ICE raids were coming and taking these families away, or taking these people away. And so kids were coming home to an empty household, or one parent and a father who was being deported. The Migrant Protection Protocol, which is known as the Remain in Mexico policy, was something that was enacted at the end of last year. And the idea is that you come and you claim asylum to Customs and Border Protection, and you are sent back across the border to remain in a camp until your immigration case comes up. This has not been a safe opportunity for any of our families. There have been gangs that infiltrate these camps, and migrant protection is really kind of a misnomer. It really puts people at risk. We have had kids come across the border and talk to us about how they have watched the gangs beat up or rape a family member, and really is quite horrible. And what's happened because of the migrant protection protocol is that the families are going across the border, they are remaining in these camps, and they're making the horrible decision to send their child across the border because they know about the Flores Settlement Agreement. They know that their children will be treated kindly, and they want the best for their children, even if that means separating from them. So what happened with COVID-19 and asylum? This is just one additional horror for these families. This was a CDC ruling in March of 2020. The order suspending introduction of certain persons from countries where a communicable disease exists. This is an old CDC order that was designed to help protect Americans from tuberculosis and dengue fever and things like that. And it was applied to coronavirus, even as the United States has been the epicenter of coronavirus in the world. And the order was extended indefinitely in April 2020. What this has sadly done is it effectively ended asylum in the United States. So people are not being allowed in to even claim credible fear. And it effectively ended the provisions of the Flores Settlement Agreement in the United States. And this has had some really devastating consequences with our children. So now what happens is that minors crossing the border are placed in a Department of Homeland Security detention center and then placed in the custody of a private prison contractor and sent to stay in a hotel. So there's no interview, there's no medical exam, there's no psychological assessment, there's no contact with family members, there's no access to legal advocates. And these minors are being expelled to their country of origin within 72 hours with their parents in Mexico, which is absolutely horrific. And we know that nearly 9,000 unaccompanied migrant children have been expelled from the U.S. And I'm saying expelled and not deported because being deported means that you have had the due process that you are deserving of. And that's not happening here. These kids are going from the border to the private prison system, to a hotel, back to their home country. So what do we do about this as a medical community? We understand that there are barriers of care to immigrants and there's a lot of fear. And knowing this, there are some resources that we can look to. The American Academy of Pediatrics has put in a statement on providing care for children in immigrant families. And in addition, there is a resource called the Immigrant Child Health Toolkit. And you could actually just Google the Immigrant Child Health Toolkit and you will find background, some clinical care, immigration status FAQs. What are our immigrant families eligible for? What is one of the best things that you can do in practice, knowing the trauma that these families have experienced, is let them know what are the resources that they are eligible for. What can they access for themselves or their children that is not going to raise the ire of public charge? And then there's state legal resources as well too, because California is very different than Texas, is very different than New York. And knowing what you can do for your families in your state is most important. Translating science to the public. One of the activities we've done a lot through the American Academy of Pediatrics, and particularly the Council on Immigrant Families and Children, is this. It's talking about toxic stress. It's talking about separation of parents and children and what that damage is doing and how we really need to reframe the idea of illegal immigration to victims of a global refugee crisis. Because if you look at this, sadly, we are at stage 7 of genocide. If you think about this, we have been divided into us and them. People were forced to identify themselves, even people who are citizens of the United States. There has been systemic discrimination. You have heard some of our leaders equating our people coming to the southern border as vermin, animals, diseases. There are specific groups to enforce these policies, and we hear propaganda to turn the populace against the group. And now we've got that official action to remove and relocate people. We are going down a very, very solemn, hard, dark path here in the United States. And history will remember the 2017 to 2021 period of time in the United States as a time that was really very dark for human rights, where there were a number of human rights and child rights abuses. What do you do to try to keep yourself hopeful during this time? I find that every time I can connect a family to the right resource, or I can let a family know that their child will be safe, that they can get that medical care, that this is something that brings me hope. And I have one great story from my time in Dilley, which was really particularly horrifying. I saw two little girls who were both from Honduras, and they were friends in their fifth grade classroom. And they happened to make very separate journeys up to the United States, and they happened to wind up in Dilley together. And they saw each other from across the room, and they ran over and hugged. And I had a pad of paper, and they were drawing pictures and writing their names and writing, "I love you." And it was actually very humanizing. And come to find out, at the beginning of this year, one of these little girls is in Los Angeles, and I happened to see her in Ultimate. And you see this, and you know that her family is doing okay, and that there's hope. We have a service at Children's Hospital Los Angeles with Ultramed called La Lanterna, which is it is a clinical service for some of our families who've come across as immigrants and refugees. And this puts together health, mental health, and immigration services and attorneys to help out these families. That there is hope. There's a lot that we're doing as advocates here. And I'm going to end off with one last letter that I got that I read all the time because I need to do this. And it really helps to focus me in terms of where our youth are and where our kids are with regard to diversity and inclusion and welcoming people who have come from places of trauma. And this letter was from a fifth grader, and it said, "Dear President of the American Academy of Pediatrics, I think the world needs you, especially the children. They have done nothing wrong. They are practically in jail because they're immigrants, and it doesn't mean they should be treated differently. Gandhi changed the world with kindness, and I thank you for all you do." And understand that as a healthcare provider, as a physician, as a doctor, as a nurse, as a therapist, advocacy is part of your DNA. And your patients drive what you do in terms of what you do in the office, what you do in the clinic, and what you do outside the clinic. So be the change that you want to see in this world. And with that, I'm going to say thank you for being part of this Visions and Voices. Thank you for the healing that you do and will do. And I will open up for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kraft. Before we turn to questions, I just wanted to acknowledge I failed to recognize one of my faculty partners, Dr. Sophia Greskin. And we're really grateful for her partnership, as well as for our partnership with the USC Institute on Inequalities and Global Health, which she directs. So I'm so sorry, Dr. Greskin, for failing to acknowledge you. So Dr. Kraft, we have some really wonderful questions for you. The first is from Karen Rogers, who asks if you can speak to reports of therapy sessions provided under Flores being used against children in their hearings.
So what has happened is that many children who've been traumatized have been connected with therapists when they're in one of the Office of Refugee Resettlement shelters. And sadly, what was happening is that therapists were being forced to disclose some of the things these kids had told them. And some of these kids had to do horrible things to defend themselves. So they might have had to murder somebody. They might have had to steal something. And what was happening is that this was being used against these children in immigration court to call them a criminal and then deport them. Again, just part of the inhumanity that's happened through this whole process.
Thank you. Does Laura Longoria asks, does the World Health Organization have any programs to help with situations like these? All of the refugee issues around the world, do nations around the world help contribute to an international fund to help? Can the UN help? And she expresses her sadness and being disheartened about all of this.
So the UN has the Human Rights Commission, and they have programs for refugees around the world as well too. And there are many nonprofits that actually do much of this work. I was actually in Beirut about a year ago, this last year, and worked with a group called War Child that actually went into the Syrian refugee camps, which were really different than our family detention centers. When you went into this group was working with girls, and the girls were telling me, I want to be a teacher when I grow up. I want to be a doctor when I grow up. And you can use some of your nonprofits to really help with trauma-informed care and help these families in that whole resettlement, in their whole displacement and becoming full through this process. The United States has not chosen to do that, but it is happening in other places around the world. And again, this is really reframing illegal immigration to victims of a global refugee crisis. And if we do that, then we can take advantage of NGOs as well as some of the UN and World Health Organization resources to help people.
Great, thank you. How can individual American citizens keep the momentum moving forward to reverse the stage of genocide we're now in?
I think, again, the greatest thing that we are going to be able to do in the next few weeks is vote. We have an administration who has set forth these policies that are abhorrent, and we need to stand up and say, this is awful. We do not accept this. As Americans, we are better than this, and vote. That will be the ultimate amount of change. But I think the understanding too that people come because of fear, and understand that if somebody is in this country illegally, that there's a reason why they're here, and to show some compassion, to be able to give to some of the organizations around that help out families. There's one locally called Every Last One that is helping to connect some of these kids with their parents and with their families. But look up some of these organizations and be part of the solution.
Thank you. Another participant says, thank you for speaking with us and for all the work you do. I'm a first year in the occupational therapy program. This is the exact population I want to work with. Where should I begin to volunteer? Which organizations should I connect with?
I would start to ask some of your professors in occupational therapy about opportunities to do this. There may be some opportunities to work through some of our regional centers, or through some of our school systems, or through some of our family organizations that work with some of our displaced population. But all a good place to ask to start to look at where can you connect with folks.
Thank you. Do you have any insights about ACEs, the epigenetics, and the long-term generational effects that you can share?
What we see with ACEs and long-term effects are our depression, our anxiety, our difficulty with getting into school. And I think that what's important to know is that there is great evidence that these things exist. What we see on the other side is somebody who's not doing well with school, somebody who's getting into a lot of fights, somebody who's having depression and anxiety. And the important part here is to connect them to trauma-informed care resources, because somebody who looks at that disability and looks at that problem through that traumatic lens has some specific skills in helping these families address that and begin to heal.
Yeah, a question from me. I've had some difficulty finding resources for trauma-informed care for my little patients. And I know that Children's Hospital is a great place for this, but I think the need outstrips the the resources sometimes. Do you have
I
any?
would say you're right. I think that we're beginning to understand this, but first of all, getting that child connected, and secondly, especially with COVID, continuing to do that connection, and particularly in a virtual world where many of our very underserved families don't have broadband access, so that virtual appointment is tough to do. These are all things that really become challenges for our families. I would love to see an organization like a Spectrum or a Cox actually do some work in just providing broadband to some of our families who need it. That would be a great first step. But again, this is kind of advocacy and beginning to put it into action.
Great. We have a question that says, thank you for sharing. This is so important to acknowledge that this is government sanctioned abuse. Are there steps we as future clinicians can take to help push, educate, and advocate for this change and so it never happens again?
I think as doctors, you start with your patient. You start with what you see from your patient. You start with the science. And what you want to do is be involved and be informed in policies. And you can start at your local practice level, your local hospital level. But talk with your legislators and talk with your elected officials and talk with people who run businesses and run organizations that all of us use, but particularly some of our more underserved families. Those are all good places to start. And as you work within the community, you begin to find who it is you can talk to about certain issues and certain problems, whether it is getting jobs, whether it is accessing healthcare, whether it is accessing safe housing. So find one connection that you're interested in, maybe on behalf of one of your patients, and that's where you start.
All right. I think we have time for one more question. Let's see here. Any specific websites, organizations, or specific representatives we should contact?
Your best representative contact is your representative, because they represent you, and let them know, particularly if you take care of families who have been refugees, what's going on, what's happening with these people. That particularly if you're in an area that isn't California, in an area that tends to be more conservative, the rhetoric is that they're crossing illegally, where we know that they're not allowed to cross legally, and people are being sent back to dangerous conditions. Using that one patient's story with a legislator means the world. It means more than any data that you can show them. And then offer with a particular legislator to be a contact in case they want to know more about what's happening with families, because that begins that bi-directional conversation where you can work together and make a difference in something.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Kraft. There are many more questions, sadly too many for us to answer here, and many expressions of gratitude for your talk. So I will relay those to you. And I'm going to ask you, I'll put you on the spot, because you are part of our Trojan family, may people who have additional questions or need resources contact you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody has. I'm really thrilled that you tuned in to this Vision and Voices to hear about this topic, because it is sadly so timely. And the good thing is that we're at a point where we can make a change. And it's so important for our own humanity.
Thank you so much. I want to just take a moment as well to, again, thank our Visions and Voices team, and to let people know that this is the first in a series of 3 events that my faculty partners and I are presenting this year. In January, Homer Venters, who's a physician and epidemiologist, will talk about his work. He's the author of Life and Death in Rikers Island, and grew out of his work as chief medical officer for New York City's jails. And Kate Gilmore will be here in March, and she just completed 5 years as United Nations Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights. So we hope you'll be able to join us for those events as well. With that, we will sign off. Thank you so much again.
Thank you.